The phone call came at 11:47 on a Thursday night. I know the exact time because I had just looked at my phone, thinking about whether to text my husband to say I was stuck in traffic on the 401 and would be home late. I never sent that text. The officer's voice was calm in that specific way that people are calm when they've had to do something terrible many times. He asked if I was the wife of Joel Hartley. I said yes. He told me there had been an accident on Highway 400 north of Barry. A transport truck had crossed the centre line. I don't remember what I said after that. I remember the sound of rain on the windshield. I remember pulling over onto the shoulder, somewhere near the Finch exit, and just sitting there, engine running, hazard lights clicking. Joel was 31 years old. He coached minor hockey on Saturday mornings and made terrible puns and always burned the garlic bread. He had been coming home from a work conference in Sudbury. He never made it past Barry. I was 29 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone on the side of a highway. The next 72 hours are a blur I've spent years trying to piece back together. Someone drove me to the hospital. A social worker named Denise sat with me for a long time in a room with beige walls. My mother-in-law, Gwen, flew in from Victoria and held my hand so hard my fingers went numb, and I was grateful for every second of it. My parents called from Kelaniya the next morning. My mother cried. My father said he was devastated. They said they were going to pray for me. They said to let them know if I needed anything. And then my mother said carefully that they were still planning to leave for their trip to Portugal in 9 days. They'd booked it a year ago. Non-refundable, she said. Fully non-refundable. I told myself I understood. People had lives. Joel and I had been independent. We didn't ask for help easily. And I still had Gwen. I told myself it was fine. It was not fine. Isola came 6 weeks early. She arrived at 11:22 in the morning on a Friday, weighing 4 pounds and 9 ounces, screaming with a ferocity that startled everyone in the delivery room, including me. The doctor said that was a good sign. I chose to believe her. They put Isla in the NICU immediately. Her lungs weren't fully developed. She had something called a grade 1 brain bleed, which the neonatologist told me was the least severe kind, but the word brain and the word bleed in the same sentence about my 4-pound daughter will live in my chest for the rest of my life. She was in an incubator, with tubes and monitors and a tiny knitted hat some volunteer had made. I sat next to her every day and talked to her about whatever came into my head. The weather, the Leafs, how her father used to argue that pineapple on pizza was a legitimate choice. She'd squeeze my finger sometimes and I'd have to remind myself to breathe. The NICU stay was projected to be 6 to 8 weeks. The bill started almost immediately. Here is something people don't talk about enough in Canada. OHIP covers the medical procedures, yes, but it doesn't cover everything that wraps around a crisis like this. It doesn't cover the $1,800 a month parking at the hospital because you're there 12 hours a day. It doesn't cover the meals because you're not home to cook. It doesn't cover the short-term disability gap when your employer's policy has a clause about pregnancy-related early leave. It doesn't cover the cost of the grief counsellor my obstetrician told me I needed urgently and who had a 14-week wait at the public clinic, but a next week appointment if I paid out of pocket at $180 a session. Joel had life insurance, a good policy, but insurance companies don't move quickly, and the estate couldn't be settled until probate cleared, and probate in Ontario does not clear in 6 weeks. I needed $22,000 to get through the gap. That's what my accountant estimated. And yes, Joel's father had insisted I get one immediately, which was the most practically loving thing anyone did for me in those first months. $22,000. I called my parents. They were in the Algarve. My mother answered on the 3rd ring, and there was the sound of a restaurant in the background, glasses and voices and someone laughing nearby. I told her everything, the NICU, the bills, the gap in the insurance. I had my accountant's numbers in front of me. I told her I needed help, a loan, not a gift. I would pay it back with interest once probate cleared, which my lawyer estimated would be another 8 weeks. There was a pause. My mother said she would have to discuss it with my father. She said that the money they had in their savings was earmarked, that they'd had a hard few years financially, which was news to me. They had sold their house in Kelowna the previous year and downsized into a condo. They'd mentioned the Portugal trip had been upgraded to business class. She said she didn't want to promise anything she couldn't deliver. She said that to me. Her daughter, sitting outside the NICU at 9 o'clock at night on a plastic chair with a sick baby inside and no husband anywhere. She called back 2 days later. My father was on the call too. He said they had gone over their finances. He said the money was in a GIC that would have a penalty if broken early. He said they were very sorry. He said they were praying for Isla and for me. I said thank you. I hung up. I sat in the hallway outside my condo. I'd come home to get a change of clothes. And I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything. Just a kind of cold settling in that I didn't have a word for yet. My sister-in-law Renata was the one who helped me figure out the money. She and her husband put in 8,000. Gwen liquidated some RRSP savings and covered the rest. They did it without being asked twice. They did it in one phone call. I paid them back to the dollar 8 weeks later with a bottle of Chateau Petrus that Joel had been saving for a special occasion. I figured this counted. Isla came home in March. She was 6 weeks old by then, round-cheeked and furious about everything, exactly like her father. I brought her into the apartment and stood in the hallway for a long time, just holding her, not moving. My parents came to visit in May. 4 days. They stayed at a hotel downtown. Their idea, which I appreciated more than they knew, because I was not sure I could have managed politeness at close range for that long. They brought gifts. They made the right sounds over Isla. My mother cried when she held her. My father said she looked like Joel. I was civil. I was pleasant. I handed my daughter to my mother and watched her coo and rock and talk about how she'd knit a blanket before they arrived, and I thought, you weren't here. You were drinking wine in Portugal when I was sitting outside the NICU wondering if my daughter was going to survive, and now you're here for the easy part. But I didn't say any of that. I made coffee, and I nodded, and I thanked them for coming. And after they left, I sat on the floor of Isla's room and cried harder than I had since the night on the 401 shoulder. The break came 8 months later, over Christmas. My parents had invited me to Kelowna. Isla's first Christmas. They wanted the whole family together. My brother Derek and his wife were coming down from Edmonton, and my parents had decorated and planned a big dinner. It was going to be wonderful, my mother said. A real healing Christmas. I told my mother I was not ready for a big Christmas, that Isla and I were still finding our rhythm, that the grief was still very close, and I needed something quiet. My mother said she understood. Then she called back 2 days later to say that Derek had suggested maybe I was isolating too much, that it might be good for me to be around family, that sometimes healing required effort. I want to be precise here about what happened next because I've replayed it many times. I said calmly and quietly that I did not believe she had been available when I needed her, and that I was not in position right now to put the comfort of others ahead of my own and Isla's well-being. I said that I needed some time and space and that I hoped she could respect that. My mother started to cry. She said she didn't understand why I was punishing her. She said she had apologized. She said she and my father had felt terrible about the situation and had thought about it constantly. I said that thinking about it wasn't the same as being there. She cried harder. I said I needed to go put Isla down. We hung up. I did not call Kelowna for Christmas. They sent gifts for Isla. I sent a photo of Isla in a reindeer hat and a one-line thank you. That was the last real conversation I had with my mother for almost 2 years. I want to say that the next 2 years were purely about survival and rebuilding, because that's the cleaner story. The truth is messier. I was angry in a way I didn't have language for. I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I loved Easter so completely that some days it was the only thing that made sense. Gwen flew out from Victoria every 2 months like clockwork. She'd stay for a week, take the night shifts, let me sleep. She'd make enormous pots of soup and put them in labelled containers in the freezer. She never once made me feel like I owed her anything. She talked about Joel the way I needed people to talk about Joel, not carefully, not around the edges, but directly, remembering specific things. The way he'd narrate grocery shopping like a sports broadcast, the puns, the garlic bread. Renata texted every week without fail. Not, "Let me know if you need anything," actual texts. "I'm bringing dinner Thursday, do you want butter chicken or Thai?" That kind of specific committed love is what kept me vertical some weeks. My parents sent birthday cards for Easter. My mother sent a Christmas package. We exchanged polite, brief texts. I was not cruel. I was not warm. I was managing. The call I didn't expect came in January, 2.5 years after the accident. My brother Derek called, not texted. Derek and I had always been cordial rather than close. 5 years between us, different temperaments, different cities. He said he was calling about our parents' estate. They had both died. I had not known. This part I need to explain carefully, because I understand it sounds extraordinary. My mother had been diagnosed with a rapid progression neurological condition 18 months earlier. Derek had known. He had been the one managing things from Edmonton, handling appointments and paperwork and decisions. At some point, and I don't know exactly when this decision was made or by whom, I had been moved to the edges of communication. A phone call here, a text there. My mother had declined to tell me the severity of her diagnosis, and Derek had respected that choice. She died in September. My father, whose health had been fragile for years in ways I hadn't been told about, died 3 months later in December. Derek had managed both funerals, had not called me in time to be there for either. I sat with this information for a long time before I said anything. Derek, to his credit, sounded genuinely uncomfortable. He said there had been decisions made that he hadn't entirely agreed with. He said my mother had felt the distance between us was my choosing, and she hadn't wanted to force contact when she was ill. He said she had believed I would reach out when I was ready. I told him I had needed more than a few weeks. I had not needed 2 years of managed silence. He said he knew. Then he told me about the estate. My parents' condo had sold for just over $900,000 the previous spring, before my mother's diagnosis, as part of a planned downsizing. They had investment accounts. They had RRSPs. The total estate, after costs and taxes, was approximately $1.2 million. $1.2 million. My parents had $1.2 million when I sat outside the NICU, and they were in the Algarve. Derek said there was a will. He said the will, written in 2019, left the estate split equally between him and me. He had a copy he would send. He was in touch with an estate lawyer in Kelowna, and the process would move to probate. I thanked him. We hung up. I called my own lawyer the next morning. I want to be clear about something, because I've thought about it carefully. I was not motivated by the money, or not only by the money. I was motivated by the facts that I wanted someone, somewhere, to acknowledge the full truth of what had happened, that my parents had more than enough, that they had chosen not to help, that my daughter's first weeks in this world had been terrified and underfunded, and they had been in the Algarve. Isla was 3.5 by then. She was healthy, strong, and completely obsessed with dinosaurs and anything that involved running. She called her grandmother Gwenny, and climbed her like a jungle gym. She had no grandparents in Kelowna she could remember, because I have kept that distance, and I have had to make peace with that choice and what it cost her, which is its own separate grief. My lawyer reviewed the will. It was legitimate. Derek had no grounds to contest it. He wasn't trying to. He said he had no interest in fighting, that he wanted to move forward fairly. There was a moment in my lawyer's office in downtown Toronto, looking at papers that translated my parents' lives into columns of numbers, where I had to decide what I wanted this to mean. I thought about Gwen liquidating her RRSPs for a daughter-in-law she'd met 4 times before Joel died. I thought about Renata showing up with butter chicken on a Thursday. I thought about Isla in the incubator with her tiny hat, squeezing my finger, fighting so hard. I thought about my mother saying the money was earmarked. I accepted the inheritance, every cent. I don't speak at length about my parents to Isla. She is too young to hold the weight of any of it. and frankly, I don't want her to have to. When she asks about Grandma and Grandpa in Killanura, which she does sometimes, because she's heard the names and children are perceptive, I tell her that they loved her the best way they knew how, and that we have Gwenny and Auntie Renata, and that is enough love for anyone. I believe that is true. I also believe it doesn't cover everything. My brother Derek and I have an odd relationship now. We speak a few times a year. There's real history between us that we're both too tired to fully excavate. He said once, obliquely, that he had spent a long time being the son who stayed close, and that he understood now there were costs to that closeness that he hadn't calculated. I think he was trying to tell me something about my parents and their choices that he hadn't been able to say directly. I didn't push. We're not close enough for that yet. Maybe someday. Gwen is coming next month. She and Isla are going to bake something catastrophic and watch dinosaur documentaries, and I'm going to sit on the couch and drink tea and feel, for a few days, like everything is reasonably okay. This is not a small thing. This is actually enormous. Isla has a college fund now, a real one. And the house we moved into last fall has a backyard where she can run, which she does constantly, at full speed, with the absolute conviction that the ground will hold her. I am 32 years old. I have a daughter who is terrifyingly alive. I have people in my corner who showed up when it mattered. Some days that is more than enough. Some days I still sit in the dark after Isla is asleep and feel the weight of everything that happened, and I let myself feel it, because I've learned that trying to put it away doesn't make it smaller. But I get up in the morning. I make her oatmeal. She tells me about dinosaurs at full volume while I drink my coffee. That's where I am. That's how this ends. I used to think that the hardest part of what happened was losing Joel. And that is still true in the way that a foundation is true. It's underneath everything, always. But there's a second loss that took me longer to name, and it's the one that I think about on quiet nights when Isla is asleep and the house is finally still. It's the loss of who I thought my parents were. I had built a version of them in my head. Careful people, loving people, people who would show up when it actually mattered. And then I sat outside a NICU at 9 o'clock at night and called my mother, and the version I'd built didn't answer. Someone who needed to check their GIC schedule answered instead. That's not cruelty in the dramatic sense. That's something quieter and harder to explain. It's the kind of failing that doesn't announce itself. It just reveals itself, slowly, when the pressure is real enough. I've had to be honest with myself about my own parts in all of it too. I kept the distance going longer than I needed to, maybe. There were moments when I could have reached out and didn't, because I was protecting something. My pride, my grief, some idea of fairness. I'm not sure I was wrong to protect those things, but I hold them honestly because that's the only way any of this makes sense to me now. What I know is this: Gwen didn't have to liquidate her RSPs. Renata didn't have to show up every Thursday with dinner. They chose to, over and over, without being asked, without keeping score. They chose it. That's not luck. That's character. It's what people are made of when you strip everything else away. I think about that when Isla asks me questions I don't have perfect answers to. She's 4 now, and she asks a lot of questions. Why do leaves change colour? Why do dogs dream? Why doesn't she have a daddy like her friend at daycare? I answer as honestly as I can, at whatever level she can hold. I've decided that's the only thing I can really give her, the truth in portions she can carry. There's a version of this story where I spend the next 20 years being defined by what my parents didn't do. I understand that version. I've visited it, but I don't want to live there. Because Isla lives with me, and she deserves a mother who is building something rather than just guarding a wound. The inheritance sits in an account with her name on it. Not as a symbol of justice exactly, more as a simple fact. She came into this world under impossible circumstances, and she is going to have every possible chance I can give her. Her father would have wanted that. I want that. That's enough reason. I get up every morning and make her oatmeal and listen to her explain the dietary habits of the Ankylosaurus. She does this with complete authority. I drink my coffee and I think, this is what held. When everything else fell apart, this held. Her and the people who showed up. And the slow, stubborn decision to keep going anyway. That's not nothing. That's actually everything.